This week, a lot of excitement in a variety of news outlets about melting down a statue of Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, and thus further erasing the history of the Democrat Party here in the United States of America. Seems to be a pastime of the left to, throughout history, to constantly erase the evidence of its sins. For more on this, let's bring in Chris Bedford now. He's the executive editor of the Common Sense Society magazine and joins us on the phone. Hey, Chris, good to have you back with us, sir.
Great to be here.
I love how they're like, oh, the statue was secretly melted down. This is the Robert E. Lee statue from Charlottesville. And it's not much of a secret because there's videos of it and it's all over the place right now.
Yeah, it was given to the Washington Post to show online. I mean, it's important to remember what was going on when this statue first came down. And there was a lot of talk about healing and a lot of talk about justice and a lot of talk about bringing people together. And then they took this down and they sent it to supposedly a museum, but it's really just a group of activists essentially are rewriting a lot of history and putting out terrible art where it was supposed to be handled in some kind of a dignified way. And then they made this video. And then, when you see this video of this beautiful statue melting, breaking down, you see it sent out by all these reporters. You're not looking at a nation that's coming together. You're not looking at a symbol that's even meant to stand for healing or an end to division. You're looking at a public humiliation ritual like they had in the ancient world. This is designed to show people, hey, I know that a lot of people were suing, a lot of people were trying to find out what happened to the statue. We'd promised there was going to be displayed in the museum. But that's not the case. We're actually going to melt it down, and we're going to show it, and you're going to have to watch. And it's just a sign of a sick country.
Yes, yeah, and like I said at the outset, the left has really specialized in a very unique form of gaslighting, I would say, which is that first of all, this is the reality of American history is that this is the Democrat Party who's governed so many of these horrific racially prejudiced moments throughout our history, and Robert E. Lee and his being a Confederate general and trying to protect the Confederacy and to protect the institution of slavery. That's the kind of thing that is worth remembering, not erasing. And so this has kind of a twin effect for the left. One, they suggest that it's actually their political opponents who are the Robert E. Lee people, and which is why this needs to be burned. And simultaneously, they're actually erasing the evidence of their own sins.
They are. This is not a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest or some more controversial figure in the Civil War. Robert E. Lee was remembered by the people who he fought against, literally who he raised arms against as a gentleman and someone who was a uniter. This was someone who felt a deep affinity and a deep loyalty to Virginia. It's a place that he called his country. And this is someone who was he thought secession was a bad idea. This is someone who had grave reservations and worries about the sin of slavery. He's a more complicated man than is being portrayed. He did take up arms against his country, and he suffered a great deal for that. 600,000 Americans died. I think about literally 2%, I think, of the country at the end of it. But at the time when the war was over, he became kind of a national hero and someone who was a uniter, someone who pushed very in a hard way to try and bring the North and the South back together, which really didn't happen until the end of the 19th century with the Spanish-American War, when people started to talk. And so that's history. That's context. That's something that should be talked about. That's something that should be taught. Sure. But the left's not interested in that. They just want to take it down and melt it.
And I should point out that not only do they want to melt a statue of Robert E. Lee, they want to melt every statue of every American founder that they can melt as well. I mean, or any American president or famous American figures. I mean, for instance, you watched up in New York as the left led a movement to remove a statue of Teddy Roosevelt from outside front of the museum up there. Additionally, here in Washington, D.C., there's the Freedmen's Monument of a slave literally rising from his shackles as Abraham Lincoln is there, the man who's known for, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation and seeing the country through during the Civil War. And there's the left wanted to remove that. Frederick Douglass was at the dedication of that statue. And the left has this immense appetite to destroy any sign of both our past and certainly of its dignity.
And I lived in that neighborhood at the time and was down there a lot, and the whole thing was a lie. I'd lived in that neighborhood for about 12 years, and there were people outside suddenly protesting, saying, "We have said this statue is harmful for years. We have asked for it to be removed for years, but no one's listened. And now we'll take matters into our own hands." And I'm sitting there with a bunch of neighbors saying, no, you haven't. None of you live in this neighborhood. None of us have ever seen you. None of us have ever so much as seen a poster on a tree that said this statue is hurtful or this statue is offensive. And they're out there saying, we haven't been heard, therefore we're out to tear down this statue of Abraham Lincoln and a freed slave. The whole thing was gaslighting. And, actually, in some ways, sometimes they were open about their intentions. You heard the term racial reckoning often. You didn't hear the term racial reconciliation. You kept on hearing reckoning in the Washington Post and CNN.
Good point.
And I wanted to ask these people, hey, do you know what that word means? Because it doesn't mean restorative justice. It doesn't mean righting wrongs. It means hurt. The reckoning means a punishment. It's not something that brings community together. It's something that punishes those you think have wronged you. And that's exactly what we're seeing, unfortunately.
Yeah, and the people who have been cheering the destruction of these statues with each passing week are more and more exposed for being the demons that they are, right? Because, for instance, BLM, Black Lives Matter, really all the fervor in 2020 around the George Floyd riots to destroy so many of these statues and things. This is kind of, in some ways, the culmination of that. You're melting a Robert E. Lee statue from Charlottesville that stood there. How long did that statue stand there in Charlottesville? It was a long time. It was from the late 1800s, I believe.
It went up in 1917 as the last kind of the veterans were passing away. Also an interesting time. That was a time when the federal government really took an active interest in trying to get the South back on its feet. I mean, it had been 50 years since the end of the war, but when there was a national draft during World War I, they found that so many Southern soldiers, they couldn't even wear the uniform because their necks were swollen from malnutrition. And that's when the federal government said, maybe it's a problem, the deep problems that are going on in the South, how much they've suffered in the 50 years since the war, and really began a trip down there to try and just bring the country up to speed, bring it back together.
Yes.
And one fortune that paid off.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. And you can't, after the Civil War, you got to imagine what were they going through. It's like you can't live with a pariah class in your country. Whereas it's just like, you're not allowed to be a part of society. We kept the Union together, but you're not allowed to be a part of it. I mean, that'd be a hell of an outcome.
It would be. And, the really sad thing about this, I mean, I'm a Northern guy. My family fought on both sides of the Civil War, but I'm from Massachusetts. What's sad about this is when we tear down this art, when we tear down these monuments, when we tear down this past, we're not putting anything up. We don't live in a society that creates a whole lot of beauty anymore. A lot of our artists are kind of frauds, just people who take advantage of the rich, and they just unveiled a Martin Luther King memorial in Boston that's weird and creepy and stupid, and even the only positive comments you could find in the newspaper was from the mayor. All the other people said, I think they're making fun of us. No, if we had a society, if you went down to Richmond today and said where all those beautiful statues once stood, we're going to put beautiful statues that maybe are more representative of Richmond today than Richmond when they were put up, then I think you would have less of an argument from some people. But they don't want to create beautiful things. They just want to destroy, and they create ugliness.
Yeah, they sure do. And I mentioned Black Lives Matter and how they're exposed. I mean, just look at what they've been supporting after the terror attack in Israel. You have Black Lives Matter chapters across the country who were tweeting support for the terror attack, images of terrorists paragliding across the border into Israel to massacre civilians, and acting as if they are in solidarity with the terrorists, which apparently they must be. And yet here you have the Washington Post kind of doing the water carrying for the very same vile people this week.
Yeah, and we have a national amnesia about Black Lives Matter. When they showed back up on the scene in 2020, you just had to think back a few years to the Obama presidency when they'd been major. And the Black Lives Matter movement that was violent then and dangerous then had ended in Texas. I think it was Texas, when a Black Lives Matter gunman opened fire and killed a number of cops. And suddenly everyone wanted to forget about it. Then they came back 3 years later, or 45 years later. Everyone is saying, oh, what is this new movement? Are they here to spread peace? No, they're anti-family. They're Marxist. They're racist. It's not a healthy movement. A lot of people got very rich from it. A lot of corporations gave a lot of money.
You mentioned the fact that there's not enough appreciation for an encouragement of art in the United States, true art, valuable art, beautiful art. Do you sense that there will be a sea change on that subject? I know at the tail end, for instance, of the Trump administration, Donald Trump had clearly somebody had gotten to him and gotten in his ear and said, yeah, we need a lot more of that. We need some beauty. He had even proposed an entire park of statues dedicated to American heroes. Do you think that we will reach a turning point on this subject?
Yeah, I think we are starting to do that, where people are looking around at the brutalism and the architecture of the 60s and 70s and saying, why don't I have a say in this? Why do I need to have ugly buildings? Civic architecture is something that the public has to pay for, and the public, it's a symbol of your community and your government and your nation, and it's something that everybody sees. It's not just a private painting hanging in a museum or in a room. It's public, and I think that's the first thing that's starting to change. Is people are saying, why not beauty? But it does take some education, and I've been happy to just to make people feel confident enough. You don't need a master's degree or anything, any kind of a degree, to know what beautiful is. And that's one of the lies that the modern art movement's really put over on people in the modern architecture is just, hey, you guys aren't experts, you don't understand. But just enough education to let people think, you're allowed to speak your mind. You're allowed to say that new sculpture makes no sense. You're allowed to say that City Hall is very ugly. We have a voice in it. We get that confidence. I think we'll see things start to change.
Yeah, we don't need another building that's just a cube made of concrete or another building that's just all glass. Like, give us something that lifts us up. The human spirit is edified by art. And by the way, to get spiritual, it all points to heaven in the end. The more beauty you see. Okay. Hey, Chris Bedford, thank you as always, sir. Really appreciate your time as always and all of your excellent work. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Vince, and congratulations on your big win last night.
Not quite. Chris is referencing there was an event last night. It was a stand-up comedy thing. I didn't even really want to talk about it that much because it was my first try at stand-up comedy. I came in second place behind the excellent Mary Catherine Ham. But the upshot of that is both WMAL people, in her case, a WMAL alum, ended up taking home the top prizes last night. So thank you for that. Really appreciate that, Chris.